Hello and welcome to the Small Talk series brought to you by the Bagri Foundation. Today we'll be talking about the art of documentary film with Benjamin Dix and Richie Mehta. Benjamin Dix is a photographer who worked internationally with NGOs before setting up his own company, Positive Negatives, to bring together art and humanitarian issues. Richie Mehta is a film director and screenwriter whose film Amal has won multiple awards internationally. Most recently, he completed a science fiction film starring Gillian Anderson called I'll Follow You Down. Without further ado, let's hear from Richie Mehta and Benjamin Dix.
Nice to meet you. This is, I guess, the first time we're actually meeting.
Yeah, good morning. Hi, nice to meet you too.
So when I sent you my stuff to take a look at, your first response was, oh, I lived in Delhi. When and why?
When and why? So I lived in Delhi from on and off from about 2001 to about 2007.
Okay.
And kind of went in and out of Delhi. But I first went to India in 1996. Mm-hmm. So after my A-levels, I left and went to India. And within about 2 weeks of arriving in India, I found myself up in the Himalayas, where I found I was kind of walking in the mountains with a friend of mine and who I'd met in India, and we found this cave ashram of Naga Babas, and the sun was going down. They said, come and stay for the night. There were 7 of them and the guru, all naked with the ash, and we stayed for a night. We stayed for 2 nights. The guy that I was traveling with, his visa was running out, so he left, and I ended up staying for about 9 months.
And I mean, obviously, we're not going to have time to go into details, but
Sure.
but start to finish, what is that transformation?
I don't know. There was a calmness in me which came back at later periods of my life. I guess maybe I didn't really notice it at the time. I began to become very calm. I was doing a lot of yoga and meditation. The guru gave me a mantra which I just constantly said as I walked and moved around the forest, and there's a calming to yourself and a kind of introspection, and I didn't become religious. That was quite clear that I wasn't suddenly. We were doing these pujas in the morning and I was fully engaged in them. Maybe it was more of an understanding of spirituality rather than religion. Uh-huh. And I started to become very interested in what was happening to me, that getting this kind of calming and yes. But what I found was 10 years later, and we might come on to this, I was working in Sri Lanka with the UN through the conflict, and I spent a lot of times in a bunker under air attack, and I found that calmness. That bunker became that cave again, and it wasn't that I was incredibly scared. It was an adrenaline rush, but there was I went back into that space where I'd been 10 years ago, which was quite a surreal calmness amongst the chaos.
So you found basically tools that you would need later.
Exactly.
And if you didn't have that,
I think Sri Lanka would have been a very, very different experience that I could.
Would it have broken you?
I think it did break me in many respects. It took me a few years to mend myself, and there are parts of me which will never be mended from Sri Lanka. They'll always be kind of broken. But yeah, it would have been. There were times in Sri Lanka which were incredibly traumatic and really petrifying, and that experience in the cave certainly was something to hold on. It was an anchor that I could shut my eyes and I could be back in that safe space.
That's interesting, because I mean, I understand in some of your work and with the comics that you're doing as well. One of your I guess one of the issues behind it is to eliminate. I think you had said in one of the articles that said the white person perspective of this, and actually make it their experience. And yet the experience that you had of going through all this, you have to linger on it because it's so heavy. Mm-hmm. So it is a part of you.
Yeah.
So it may actually not be possible for you to separate your perspective on things as you now illustrate them to the rest of the world, even though that's what you're trying to do.
Yeah, the Sri Lanka project is very different. So the Vani book that I'm creating, which became my PhD thesis of creating this comic on testimonies from the Sri Lankan conflict. That's the one project that I feel like I have a legitimate voice in. I lived there for 4 years.
So you know it, so you have a genuine experience.
I know it and I felt it.
Yeah.
You know, like so for the past 2 years, I've been working on the Syrian crisis and interviewing Syrian refugees. I feel like the Sri Lankan situation gave me huge empathy and being able to understand and engage with refugees per se, but with Syrian refugees coming out of a conflict. But I haven't been in the Syrian conflict. I haven't been there.
Nor probably will you.
No.
Yeah.
However, in Sri Lanka, I was there for 4 years and I saw the death, I saw the destruction, I smelt it, I felt it, I cried over it, I laughed through it. We got through it through so many different emotions that project I feel like I have a legitimate voice to speak out on that one. But the other projects, I use my space as a privileged white British male, where I speak the language of the Guardian and the BBC and people, and I have access to those offices. But I try and tell as much as possible, tell the story of the Syrian refugee through my space, and that's what I'm trying to do with these projects.
So that's something that I think about often as well in the work that I'm doing. Not who is my audience in terms of, I don't cater things. I don't think you do either. You do what feels right and what the research has led you to understand. But that idea that you're now doing something for the Guardian and BBC audience, I'm probably doing things for the same audience in a manner of speaking, doing here in North America. The films I do get art house releases, what we classify as art house releases, and it gets the reviews and gets into that circle. Doesn't necessarily go beyond that circle. I'm not sure it ever will go beyond that circle just because of mainstream taste. And then the question becomes, is it actually making an impact? Is there a difference with all the energy and effort that we're putting in? Does it really matter that are we preaching to the converted? People who already have this empathy in them, and whether they read your comic or see my film or another thing along the same lines, we're not really bringing. I always say Donald Trump is not converting people. The people who agree with him already agreed with him before he showed up.
Absolutely. And that's why this year one of the main pushes for me is to get one of my comics in the Daily Mail or the Sun.
There you go, right.
And that's the audience that I want to get, because I write a story about about Syrian refugees, and it goes in the Guardian. That's fantastic. It's professionally fulfilling.
Yes, of course.
It's great. It has a very, very
high level of curation. If you get in,
but the majority of people who are reading it are probably on point with me anyway. And so, are you really changing policy and understanding and educating?
Yeah.
Whereas maybe getting it into a more right-wing mainstream media would be an interest. That's where I'll be interested in the comments below.
You're right. The death threats that come out. Yeah,
absolutely,
right.
Absolutely.
It's funny. I grew up being like a Star Wars nut. Right. I was a real mainstream film kind of consumer, and only as I grew more and more did I realize, wait a sec, there is a lot more behind these types of things. The ones that have lasted, the ones that we would deem classics in a way. There is really a lot more going on behind them. There's a very heavy socio-political message behind those as children's films. And again, I look at that and say, well, you know what? Those kind of things actually affected me and changed me and helped me to figure out my way. So maybe there's a way to hone in on that, but times have changed, right? And is it even possible to penetrate? Like right now, you're developing a canon of work, which if it gets into that space, it's taken you years to get there, and it's evolved that you've gotten there, and great. Just as easy chance that you don't get there. Not to be pessimistic, because I'm very optimistic at that. And I think the same thing. You have to figure out a way to commodify, which is playing the game, in a way, and yet keep your eye on the ball, keep your eye on the prize. Which I always tell myself that all of this is means to an end. This last part is means to an end. Even though it probably takes the most amount of time to get the resources and then get it delivered. The meat of the doing, the research that you spend the years you spend researching, that's the thing.
Yeah. And the actual product at the end of it can sometimes be tiny. I mean, you often look at, I'm sure you look at your way, it's a 2-hour film, or mine's a 10-page comic.
Yeah.
And sometimes I feel like, is that it? That was
years. That took 2 to 4 years. Yeah. Every day, all day.
That's it.
And a severed relationship.
A few. But you become proud of it, and then you move on to the next project, whatever that may be. Yeah. But what's your background into becoming a storyteller?
I mean, I had a real affinity for film since age 3, age 4. And it was the thing I found I was remembering most. I would watch movies and remember who was the AD on this and the costume designer on this. This is when I was really, really, really small. Who was the composer on this? And I was starting to identify that language of storytelling very early on. And it was penetrating. I was starting to become aware that people went to work and made these things.
Right.
And they were actually affecting me.
And always through film?
Always through film.
Okay.
It was the main medium for me. And then when I kind of went through high school and university, there was still no real, in my community, I was a suburb in Toronto. And, what we would consider a wealthy suburb, it was just middle class in that environment.
Scarborough?
Mississauga. I don't know how you possibly know that. Scarborough is a huge Tamil community.
Yeah, I've done research in Scarborough.
There you go. Yes. And so, it's very similar to that, on the other side of the circumference of the circle.
Right.
And multicultural everywhere. The public school is actually public school. It's not private school.
Yeah,
it's a different.
Yeah.
But the public school, the normal school we went to, was a mix of every type of culture you can imagine, and a very pleasant environment, very complacent environment, and people are just kind of going into their slots of academia. And nobody, even my guidance counselors, couldn't answer. Well, how do I get into film? How do I get into film? I don't know. Good luck.
Right.
So I actually ended up studying art, and I studied art and art history in university, very rigorously, painting, sculpture, and photography. I was doing and studying, and to me, it all became kind of an analysis and execution of every liberal art I could do before it became film, because they all went into film.
Yeah.
All of those disciplines have some aspect represented in film. They say editing is the only aspect of film which is indigenous to filmmaking.
Okay.
Every other liberal art that goes into it has a tradition. Right. Acting comes from Greek. Theater and music obviously comes from music, and production design comes from sculpture. So everything has a different expertise except editing. So then when I went into a post-grad film program, finally it was, for me, directing and editing was and writing, the real focus of those. So what I didn't know, this is when I graduated, I didn't know what I wanted to talk about, and I couldn't even wrap my head around how people write 90-minute to 2-hour scripts of something. I was writing 5-minute, 10-minute pieces. They were amusing things about, experiences I'd had or perceptions or thoughts. And it wasn't until I went to India.
But all of those were coming into 5 or 10 minutes, which is a long time in film as well.
My original shorts were 2 minutes. I did one that was 75 seconds.
Right.
So I was going in that mode.
Okay.
And then when I went to India, I went there to shoot a short film that my brother had written. He had written a short story because he was doing his master's in India. He came back and showed me a short story. I was so moved by it, and I ended up saying, let me go back and just do this as a short film.
And had you had a connection with India growing up?
Yeah, I mean, I'd gone as a teenager. It was really almost the cliched kid comes from middle class upbringing, and it's like, oh my God, what is this? I can't believe this is happening in the world, and it really screwed me up. But the deeper connection was I spoke the language. My grandparents grew up with us in Toronto, so I spoke Hindi fluently, and I thought, I get to go back and see my roots, and I got sick the minute I stepped off the plane, just from seeing. I mean, you know what I'm talking about. It's just like, oh my God, this is the world. I didn't realize that I was elitist or elite, and I prided myself on not being. So that was a huge awakening. And I didn't,
from a Toronto perspective.
Totally from Toronto. And when I went back, it changed everything. I never took anything for granted. Time became very valuable to me. I kind of came up with this whole thing in my head that basically, if I were to play the odds of being an Indian male boy, I should have been born by a riverside, with no parents, who just kind of abandoned me, and I have no future. And what I have is the equivalent of some guy coming to that little boy and giving that boy an envelope and saying, here's a plane ticket to Canada. There's a family that will take care of you forever. regardless of what you do. There's a healthcare system that will take care of you forever. There is free education, essentially. That's the lottery. That kid wouldn't even know. Either the kid would say, you're lying, or if he had any sort of zest in him, he would take advantage of it, knowing what the rest of his community would never have.
Sure.
And that's given. That's just luck of the draw. So that was when I was 16, and it kind of started going into my head that, oh my God, back in Canada, we have the ability, and it would be the same thing here to an extent, we have the ability to be trained as super soldiers of the earth in terms of health, in terms of understanding, in terms of education, all these kind of things. I mean, we talk about these, these guys in the U.S. soldiers send these super troopers in. We have the equivalent in every other way compared to the rest of the world, and you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So, to me, it became this whole thing, the ability of an individual to affect change is significant. And the cynical view of that is no one person can change the world, that everything has to be ripe for that change. But to me, I felt it so deep from within that we have the power of 2 or 3 or 400 or 4,000 people in other places in the world. Just like you said, you have access to desks. You have,
Yeah. And a lot of that comes down to language.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. This language of the colonizers, which First Nations people call in Canada. But I did never realize film would be my way through that. Mm-hmm. And when I went to India to shoot this short film to Delhi, and I started to have my own experiences now as a young adult, I started to realize, wait a sec, I have access to this culture. I have access to a place where you see A to Z of the best and worst of humanity right in front of you at all times. And we still consider it exotic in the West, but it is really the other world. And it is, if we want to scrape the bottom of the bottom of the bottom of the economic ladder, I have access to that because I speak the language and the culture, I know it. So why not use it? Why not use it to not exploit my own gains, because we're not in this for the money, obviously, but to communicate back what the effect of our life and lifestyle here is having on the rest of the world, and to communicate what we can learn from those environments, because I think people can very easily be dismissive. Either you can take the one stance, I mean, you talk about spirituality, which has also become a cliche in a way, and very much commodified.
No, I felt it when I said the word.
No, but
there's no other way. It is.
I mean, but that is the word.
Cliched, yeah.
But in your way, you lived it. Like I said, you give a percentage of your life to it, significant percentage of your life. So this is not you walking into Lululemon and then going to yoga classes. Not to say that that's anything wrong with that, but the exploration of the cliche, and then the other side of really what is happening when you have too many people, too few resources, and you have a society which, in my view, is not something to fear when you walk down the street at night. It is a place which is held together completely by goodwill, because there's nothing else holding that place together. Again, I'm talking about on the surface. There's much more depth to that. But even if you speak to the police in Delhi, they'll say there are 17 million people in this environment, and we have 80,000 police officers, and 45% of us are used for traffic and VIP duty, which means we cannot prevent a crime from occurring. We don't have the manpower. The fact that people are not killing each other day and night means that this place is being held together by goodwill. And the 1,000 or 2,000 bad apples we deal with in 17 million is nothing.
Yeah.
And it's bad. I mean, what they see every day is the worst thing you can the worst thing you can imagine. You know it. At the same time, how can that place exist? It's amazing to behold. I really feel it's something to behold. So can I go and glean some of that, take some of that, bring it back, and say, look, when things get really, really tough, look what we're capable of doing.
And is this what you were trying to deal with Siddhartha?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to do with that film. Yeah.
And can you explain some of that to me?
Yeah.
I mean, the kind of thought process. But firstly, who's the audience for a film like
that? I mean, Siddhartha was interesting because it was going to be I did my second and third film at the same time, but it was something that emerged really out of instinct. It was a conversation I had with a rickshaw driver who told me he had lost his son and he was looking for him. And the issues he was having in that search are not things that apply to you and me. He didn't know how to spell his son's name. He didn't have a photograph of his son. He didn't know what the internet was. And the information he was searching for at that point in time was something you and I could find on a Google search, and he was asking people on the streets for a year to decipher this piece of information. So his search was impeded from day one, and he never had a chance to get to this person in time, his son in time. And that's something that just ballooned inside me. There's so many aspects of that which I think on the surface can really bother us economically. But what I thought was so fascinating was this guy had no choice but to go to work. He didn't have a grieving period because he couldn't afford a grieving period.
Yeah.
And I said to myself, if this guy is not bashing his head against the wall, which I could see he is not because he has to support his family and go to work every day, if he can get through this, and I know everyone in my life would check out for,
sure.
if not a decade, maybe the rest of their life on this.
Yeah.
And I said to myself, my God, we are capable of so much more. We are capable, and there is a very slippery slope of self-reflection.
Well, I mean, it would be a catastrophic event in your life.
And society would understand it.
Families apart, you go into years of therapy.
Yeah, and your boss would understand. Oh my God, you come back in 10 years, your job will still be here. That's not like that. Most of the world doesn't have that. So you have to endure, and when you have to emotionally endure, it's amazing what we're capable of. I mean, look, not to reference something in bad taste, but the amount of Holocaust stories we see in popular media about endurance, emotional endurance. And there are terrible things that a human being can endure and get through it somehow. And I think we need to take cues from each other and learn from each other that, my God, there are some terrible things in the world if we choose to see them. And I think we all need to really open our eyes in a way.
I dealt with that in Sri Lanka, whereas when I started to do my research and was interviewing Sri Lankan Tamils who had survived and escaped from that conflict and were telling me stories of a level of torture that they experienced that, I'm not going to go into the specifics, but I felt physically hurt when they were telling me these stories, And these are this one woman that I interviewed, 6 months she was locked in a cell and tortured on a daily basis, and brutally physically tortured. She's now here in London. She works in a shop on the checkout. She talks about her experience to me. She's now had a child. She's got married, and she's living her life. And I'm not to say she doesn't have nightmares, and she doesn't reflect on what she's been through. But she had an ability to endure that and to move on with her life, and it didn't define her.
Nah, that's exactly it.
It didn't define her, and she now can live a life where I've seen people, and I'm not saying there's better and worse, and weaker and stronger.
No,
but I know other people who have been through a far smaller issue, and it's defined them.
Yes. So you mentioned what took you into comics? It's very, very specific it is a pop culture medium.
It is, yeah. I had no background in comics. I had a background in photography. I was bought a camera when I was 15 for my birthday and started taking pictures. And in India, I had a spell working for a newspaper as a photojournalist.
That must have been super fascinating.
Yeah, it was great. It was great. Yeah. And then when the tsunami hit, I went to Sri Lanka as a photographer to document the tsunami.
And that's what you ended up saying.
And then I ended up staying, got employed by a Norwegian NGO.
It's becoming your thing, eh? You just go somewhere and you end up staying.
Oh, yeah. No, I basically float and find my spot and float and find a spot. Okay. And through the last period before we evacuated from Sri Lanka, I spent a lot of time in this bunker. And a colleague there had a copy of Palestine by Joe Sacco, and it was the first political graphic novel, the first graphic novel I'd read, and it was about Palestine. It was about an event in Palestine, and I found this fascinating. I found it a really interesting medium to get a very complex conflict of Palestine across in a comic book form. And I sat there in the bunker, and over the space of a day and a half, I read this book cover to cover and kind of looked out from the bunker and thought, this could make a graphic novel. You've got the Tamil Tigers fighting the army, the UN sitting in the bunker, the civilians moving around, and there's a graphic novel here. So I kind of parked that idea. We then left, and as I spoke about, evacuated, and over the course of the following 2 years after the evacuation, I went through pretty intense post-traumatic stress. I had
here,
here, and I went to Sudan I couldn't handle it
where,
here.
where one goes to recover from post-traumatic stress.
Absolutely, it's great therapy. Sudan rocks, and I couldn't handle it here. I couldn't do this. I couldn't be with my friends and family. I was coming from a completely different point of reference of I'd just evacuated from a genocide, and I couldn't handle this space. So I got offered a job with landmine removal in South Sudan. So I went there.
A physical actual.
I was doing the communications, so I was there in the landmine fields, but it was other teams that were actually physically taking the mines out of the ground. But I was there photographing and interviewing and recording all of it. And while I was there, I was receiving every day, every other day, emails from Sri Lanka from colleagues that either another colleague had died or a colleague had escaped and popped up in London, Scarborough, Oslo, Zurich, wherever. And I was really holding on to this sense of abandonment. I really felt that it was, I understood it from a professional perspective. I am very critical of the UN's decision to evacuate, but I understood the larger picture. I didn't agree with it, but I understood it. But from a personal perspective, I was the one who drove out of there in bulletproof vest and left people that I'd known for 4 years in saris and rubber chapels screaming on the side of the road. And that's something that will forever stay with me. And so I came back from Sudan and started to run around these cities and visiting my old Tamil friends and recording their stories. And that was something that was therapeutic for me in a sense of, I thought at that time, maybe a sense of closure. But also for them, quite cathartic that someone actually cared, because Sri Lanka isn't a conflict that was spoken about much in the media.
Not at all, yeah.
And so I was coming back as an old friend and colleague, and I cared. And they weren't just my friends while I was there. I listened to them here. And as I started to collect these stories, I realized I kind of went back to that thought 2 years before, prior 2 years, and thought, let's do a graphic novel with this. And I teamed up with a great artist here in London called Lindsay Pollock, and he started to look at a lot of my photographs and started to illustrate them. We started to put together a little script, and then I realized, actually, this is a huge responsibility. I'm dealing with immense trauma of the respondents that I'm taking their testimonies from.
And people would read what this is and assume everything you're saying is fact.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm dealing with stories of torture, of sexual violence, of brutalities of conflict, and then migration, identity, asylum seeking, all of these issues. So I decided with that responsibility to do that as a PhD and the transformation of complex testimonies into artwork.
Interesting. Okay. So that became the entire endeavor.
Yeah, and that would give me a space to have to defend decisions that I made on with the production of this work. And so that I went into that, and within the first 6 months of kind of producing and working with these Sri Lankan stories, I realized that actually this was a really interesting medium to tell stories and to educate on complex issues like refugees, like trafficking, like all these kind of trauma. Because, as I'm sure you found as a filmmaker, it's very difficult to, as you're telling me about this in Siddhartha, the rickshaw driver, he's having he's getting on with his life. He's driving his rickshaw, but the trauma that's going on in his head. But that's really difficult for you to film as a filmmaker.
Of course.
In a comic book, we can draw that stuff. We can start splitting, if you've got a standard square panel, we can start making abstract panels, and it becomes very clear that these are his inside his head and his dreams and his trauma. And so for the work that I started to do, and the especially with the Sri Lankans so the protagonist the way we told the story, the protagonist is here in London as an asylum seeker, reflecting back on the period from the tsunami through the conflict, the migration to the UK, and the asylum seeking here. So it's all memory. And so in real time, he's here on the streets of London, and the rest of it is reflection. And comics is just a beautiful way to tell that stuff. You can switch between spaces so easily. You don't need any more funding for special effects. It's just the way you format the page.
For sure.
And so for someone who had no history or that much interest in comics. I still don't read that many comics. Like I haven't become a comic nerd at all.
Right.
It's purely a means to tell stories
Right.
that I find really interesting, and I love working with these artists. Now I work with a number of comic book artists who I really enjoy going and living in Istanbul for a year and just absorbing myself in the Syrian issues in Istanbul, interviewing smugglers and refugees and women on the street and whatever, and then coming back and working with an artist who's really smart and switched on but doesn't like to travel and sits at his desk.
That's right, and we'll take what you give.
And sits there in his dressing gown and slippers, and I sit there and tell them these stories. And then they go off, turn it into
which is
art.
what I love.
Fantastic.
I love the same aspect of film when you're working with real artists, whether they perform like actors or composers, cinematographers, and same thing. You're bringing them an idea that you've researched rigorously and really felt deeply and honed into text, and then they bring it to life, and you're like, oh my god, this is the excellence aspect. You also hit on something very interesting too. Your reflection of the experience of evacuating Sri Lanka. And what you just described, what that was. One of my favorite films I've ever seen, in fact, and I saw it here 10 years ago, it's called Shooting Dogs. I don't know if you've ever seen this film, about the Rwanda genocide, which I think is a real masterpiece. And it was, the reason it's one of my favorite films, I've never in my life cried more in any situation, and including tragedies that I've witnessed all over the place. That was a film which very similarly talks about what you just said, but with Rwanda. And there is a moment of the main character who you really spent the first hour getting behind and understanding the perspective as things are falling apart, has to make that choice of, oh my God, I got to evacuate and leave all my friends and on the truck and exactly what you just said. When you described it, I felt like I understood everything that you were talking about because that film was so successful in conveying the point of view. And I mean, it is a film. We're not talking about a life experience, but when it works, I'm very biased about this because it's happened to me as an audience. When it works, it is, to me, artistically, the most penetrating venue that one can have for communication to an audience. It gets into people's heads and it becomes memory in a way, visual and acoustic, which is really all we have. And for me, I internalize that experience so much of getting into that person's head, because you're right, we can't communicate what's happening in someone's head in a film, but you can communicate through their action, and sometimes through actions that make no sense of what they're actually thinking, and it makes us make that leap. And that movie, to me, illustrated 2 points of view. It illustrated the person who had to leave, understandably, because that's us, and I think most people, 99.99% of the world would say, yes, I have to go. And then there's that small percentage would say, you know what, I'm going to stay, come what may. And that I'm going to stay character in that film is very religious. And that was, for the first part of the film, a point of disagreement between me and that character. If I just watched this, I don't understand, I don't relate. Your obsession with, especially at this point of time, in talking about God and Jesus and service and all this kind of stuff, it's not working for me. And then that ideology gives them the courage to do something that I know for a fact I do not have the courage to do.
I wouldn't say that unless you were in that situation.
Exactly, because I'm not in that situation. So I say to myself, okay, given all this information, I would probably leave. But
put yourself in that situation, and I wanted to stay in Sri Lanka. Why would I want to stay? It's not my war. I'm not Sri Lankan. I'm not Tamil. Why would I want to stay in a place where I'm very much at physical harm? 90%.
Exactly. I'm with you on this.
Why would I want to stay? But you want to stay.
And
the most painful thing was being on the outside. Looking in.
I can completely imagine. I can imagine that. And I will never say I've been in that situation.
Even when we went for like a weekend break to the city, to Colombo for a UN meeting, but way before the evacuation. But there was a war going on. We'd have to go down for either our R&R for the weekend or for a briefing meeting. And all I could do is wait to get back. I didn't want to sit by the swimming pool, go to the nice restaurant. You know, we were in a war. We were eating rationed food.
And then you come out
5-star hotels in Colombo. I didn't want. All I wanted to do was have the meeting, get back, and go back.
No,
And I'm not a soldier, or I don't
No.
have any training like that. But you just on the outside, it's horrible.
and that's not something I would wish on my worst enemy.
Who's the audience for
Yeah.
for your films? Are you showing
Yeah.
those? Do you resonate with the Delhi audience, or is it more? Do you move them as much as you move an audience in Toronto? And is the audience in Toronto the Indian expat community, or is it the white community of Toronto? I mean, who's...
Well, the first film, Amo, the first film I
Yeah.
released when it was in the cinemas in Canada, and I would randomly walk into theaters just to see, on a Sunday night or a Friday night, see what's going on, and I would
and
find
the atmosphere in the studio.
yeah, just to feel it, it's public audience, and it was all the time. I mean, for the time it was playing, it was the cinemas I would go. It was actually full. It had a really great run.
Great.
But a sea of white heads.
Right.
And I'm saying like bright, like 80 and above.
Okay.
It seemed to be my demographic.
Wow.
And I'm like, oh, this is really fascinating. I didn't realize I was making films for that type of mature audience. And I guess it's also because my storytelling style and the films I really love are from the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Okay.
And so it actually probably is the movies that they grew up watching.
Right.
So I didn't realize that was actually happening. If that's the case, very soon my core demographic won't be around. So I hope I hope somebody can pick up the mantle. But I also say for my audience, one has to be clever in how you, like I say, commodify, make a living in this environment. Right now I'm working on a project which is being backed by Google, which is really fascinating because it will not go through the natural distribution channels of cinema at all. It will go straight to the user, and with a company like Google backing it, who knows? Yeah, it goes straight to the user. So to me, it's like, wait a second.
Whether you want it or not, it's coming to
yeah, and obviously on a project, I mean, it's about India. It's wonderful.
Yeah,
so
right.
to me, it really is something that, and it's in a way, it's the future of storytelling, and I'm really fascinated by different processes of storytelling as well. But the traditional narrative filmmaking side of me, the Stanley Kubrick side of me, which wants to spend 2 to 10 years researching and writing a script and then executing that. There are ways to get the money and there are ways to get the audience, but I find myself constantly studying mainstream films. I love mainstream films for the techniques that are used. Usually, sorry, at the risk of generalizing, usually used to no end. The end is in and of itself, just to get people to watch. But those tools can be used to entice people and in a very broad audience of sitting down, getting you to trust, getting them to trust you because it's 90% entertainment, and then you push them into a place where they never saw coming. And that becomes oh my God, I came here to get away from everything, and I really enjoyed it, but then you started tickling my consciousness. And that to me is the real trick.
And you enjoy making an audience feel slightly uncomfortable? Like with the emotions with this rickshaw driver, for example, like that's an uncomfortable story.
It is an uncomfortable story, but I don't know if uncomfortable is the right word as much as it is, it makes you feel. I hope it makes you feel. In the sense of Siddharth, I want people to feel what I felt. I really, really want that because whatever skill set I have, it's probably just communication right now. That's the best thing. That's the least worst thing I can do is communication. Somebody else may be able to take that and do something much more significant with it, and life-changing, world-changing. So the best I can do is bottle what I felt. Hope you feel it too, or at least moved to feel something, and then run with that and actually affect change in the world. Because all I can do is convey.
And how did he feel, the rickshaw driver, about the film?
He'll never know.
He didn't see it?
He'll never see it.
Why?
Because he gave me a phone number to call if I find anything, and that night I called it and it was the wrong number.
No.
And his name is the most common name in the world.
Right.
So he's gone.
Wow.
I couldn't find him again. So this was purely...
So that's interesting going back. So he has none of the resources of the Google and all of and understanding the internet and trying to find his son, and you have all of the resources. You're even working with Google now and you can't find him.
Correct.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
His name is Muhammad Ali.
Right. Okay.
And he's a rickshaw driver. Not a rickshaw driver. Yeah.
Somewhere in Delhi.
Yeah. Somewhere in Delhi.
Yeah, no, you're going to spend a few years trying to find Mohammed.
Yeah, so I figured, you know what, let's focus on the issue. Maybe we can prevent the next.
Yeah.
Rahmat Ali, who is his son, from getting taken. And you know what, the funny thing is, funny thing, the real tragedy is, nope, we never even know what happened to his son.
Right.
I actually don't even make the assumption that he was kidnapped and trafficked. The characters in the film make the assumption.
Right.
But it's also quite he could just be in a ditch. Yeah, he could. Who knows?
And I work with a lot of street kids in India with an NGO, Salam Balek Trust.
Yeah, of course, I know them there. Yeah.
And there, the number of street kids that I met who didn't actually want to run away. There were tragic stories of, they were from a village in Bihar and there wasn't even a railway station. It was just that a train stopped on the tracks one afternoon at the end of the paddy fields, and they went, there's slight adventure in them, and they went running across. Like, let's jump on the train. Train starts moving, and they've got no idea of the name of their village or where they're from, and you're gone.
Yep. Yeah.
And they were heartbreaking stories. Yeah. These weren't kids who were abused or hungry or whatever. They're loving families and just gone.
Yeah. And that's again a society which can't possibly value individual life as much as we can, because it's too much and unaccounted for. And then also there's the other side of it, which is like the China example, which is take 1 billion people and actually have everyone numbered and accounted for. And what happens in that situation, which is another film I'm exploring now, which I want to shoot in China, which would explore the difference in a way. Because I'm so fascinated by the issue of overpopulation. What happens when you have too many people with too little resources, which I think really is where we're heading anyways. And how do we cope with that? I'm not sure the focus on individual life and the value of individual life will have much merit in that extreme future. So to me, I think there's a part of me that's looking for tools to latch onto, in a way, like you found in the cave. Yeah. Of, okay, you know what, maybe individual life doesn't have any meaning, and this is actually still the optimistic side of me, because it actually gives me comfort to know that don't think so much, just go and do and love the little things too. Enjoy the glass of water, enjoy the tea that you enjoy, all these things. They're so precious, that's life. But yeah, in terms of actually making a difference, I know films have done it to me. I don't consider myself extraordinary as an audience member. So if it's happened to me, I'm sure it would happen to other people. It's just a question of, can they be bothered? Yeah. That's the big thing. Yeah. Yeah. And then are we even in an age where the world can change? Or is there inevitability to everything?
And what I'm trying to find now, I'm taking my comics this year, the big thing that we're doing, we're continuing to do projects, but we're taking them into schools.
Oh, wow.
So I've linked
here in the
up,
UK?
Here in the UK, yeah. So we're pilot testing them as from next month in secondary schools. So I've been giving presentations in schools, but now we're actually taking them out as workshops with facilitators across the country.
And it'll be available for children to...
Yeah. And there'll be homework exercises but the interesting thing that's where I've always wanted to go with these comics, is I just always thought, like, when I was at school, if my teacher gave me a comic about a refugee, and we're not dealing with the story of 20 million refugees, we're dealing with the story of Khalid or Mohammed or whoever. And it's something you can engage with and latch onto and understand that this is a brother and a son and a dad and all of these aspects, a real person. And but the interesting thing that I'm looking forward to is the feedback of actually kind of measuring the impact of this material, because it I can put a comic out in The Guardian and we get 100,000 shares and likes and all of these kind of things, and okay, that's all good. You give yourself a pat on the back.
It could be a read or a glance. People could just, this is really,
I've got no idea
Boom.
what impact this is having, apart from a lot of people clicked on a link. Whereas you take it into schools and then you go back to the kids a month afterwards. What did you learn? What do you remember? What did that make you feel? How do you look at the world differently? And you can start to get that kind of impact measurement, which will be really interesting.
My favorite aspect of showing films, when I finish a film, I travel around the world showing at various festivals and releases and things like that. And the thing I love the most is showing schools and children. And most of the time, I would say, again, 99% of the time, the response you get back from adult audiences is pretty similar across the world in different countries, which is also, to me, a fascinating thing, because to me, films are a way of presenting, like if you and I see an experience, right now we're looking at The Room, what you see is different from what I see. You and I can never have the identical experience. It's not possible, except if you watch a film. because the same two-dimensional, technically even if it's 3D, visual and acoustic stimulus is being presented, so we're experiencing the exact same thing. Now our difference in opinion on what we saw is measuring the difference between you and I.
Yeah.
And that to me is a really great way of understanding people and cultures across the world. Most of the time it's the same. The extreme difference comes in schools.
Yeah.
When you see children, they will think with lateral interpretations that you never saw coming are just as valid.
Absolutely.
And it's so, to me, it's like, my God, your brain hasn't finished forming yet.
Yeah.
So you have perspectives I
it.
can't even understand. Yeah.
I present a lot at universities,
Yeah.
and that's the same. I get pretty much the same Q&A at the end of a presentation at a university. In a school, they're throwing curveballs all the way. I'm like, where did that come from?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's great.
And
Their
it's
interpretation of my work is, I love it.
Yeah.
So now to really kind of formalize that and get that into a homework exercises and workshops and really get kids thinking about these things through the single narrative is really exciting.
Which is really, if you want to talk about affecting the audience, the next generation audience, you just went straight into like mandatory viewing.
Yeah. I mean, forget the Daily Mail. Let's get the next generation, because these are the next policymakers and bankers and whoever.
Yeah. One question I have for you: what does your utopia look like?
For me personally, or the world?
What your outlook
on
if you could say, this is what I hope would come in the extreme positive.
I don't know. That's a big question. Empathy for each other. That's
so everything else looks the same. I mean, that would obviously translate into all types of action.
Yeah. I can't answer that right now, off the top of my head. Yeah, good question.
I mean, it's something I think. Obviously, it's not an attainable period, but to me, really, really being an optimist, I think of what are we going after? What is the end goal? Is it even achievable? That is. I think everyone has empathy, placed in different vessels, and whether it's outward or inward or your family. I always, the science fiction film I made, the second film I made, really is. It takes place in Toronto, and it's about a family where, it came out of my observations that I was around so many people who are super intelligent and had empathy, but would say, "Listen, I don't have time or energy to focus on the rest of the world's issues. I got to and my kid's crying, and I got to get the stroller because it's on sale at Walmart, and I got to deal with this stuff." And I would say to myself, these, without being critical, because I understand and you have every right, you have to tend to the responsibilities you've committed to. But if everyone continues to do that and really not pay attention to the bigger picture, then those small choices every day that everyone are making you're mortgaging our future for your present. And is there a way to find the balance, especially in a place like where I come from, which is the biggest consumer in the world and the biggest consumer of electricity and biggest creator of waste? And I'm not an anarchist. I'm saying this in the most we need to figure out this balance. So I say to myself, what is that end? What are we actually going after? And maybe empathy really is just it, and that's something I'm certainly trying to do with my work as well.